War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're talking with Scott Anderson. The New York Times did something very unusual this weekend coming up. The entire issue of the New York Times Magazine is devoted to one article, well, which is divided into a number of parts. It's called Fractured Lands: How the Arab World Came Apart. Scott Anderson's most recent book is called Lawrence in Arabia: War, Deceit, Imperial Folly, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. Juan?
Well, I wanted to ask you, one of the people you profiled, Waqas Hassan, who, a former ISIS fighter in Iraq. You also interviewed about 20 other former ISIS fighters. What did you learn from those interviews and from his story?
There is an amazing pattern. As you say, I interviewed probably just around 20 ISIS fighters, all imprisoned either in Iraq or in Kurdistan now. The one pattern I found over and over again was that they're all young men, kind of with very bleak futures, either unemployed or underemployed from working class families. Not religious at all. None of these, according to them, they were not from religious families. They did not know the Quran very well. In a couple of cases, I knew the Quran better than they did. They were not recruited in mosques. They joined because their buddies joined. I mean, because they saw stuff on social media. They've all, everybody has mobile phones in that part of the world, and they'd all seen the ISIS videos. And I think it was this kind of decision that young men make, that better to live large for a couple of years and the power and the so-called glamour but the power that comes of carrying a gun, and then worry about what happens in the future, 2 or 3 years down the road. So I felt it was certainly in my experience of these kind of foot soldiers, the grunts who are primarily the ISIS members I've talked with. They had more akin to why somebody might join like an inner city gang, or why in Mexico they might join a narco gang. It's this kind of despair at seeing any sort of future, but it's not political, it's not religious. It's just this impulse to have some sort of, it's awful to say in terms of ISIS, but adventure.
But that's a quite different perspective from what we get here.
Yes.
These are religious zealots who are willing to die for Islam.
That's right. No, it's very different. And like a lot of cults, you mentioned the character and the subject of the article, Waqas Hassan. He joined up. He was brought in by his older brother. Waqas at that time was 19. His brother was 26. Part of his basic training was to execute 6 different prisoners of ISIS on 6 different occasions. So it was this kind of brutalizing process where they brought him out of the barracks, and he was told he had to shoot somebody in the back of the head on 6 different times. And he was, at this point, he's in. It's like being in a cult, and now you're there. And at least in his view, there was no way to get out once he had signed up.
You have an amazing part of the end of part 1 of your article. It's in October 2002. This was right around the time the U.S. Congress voted to authorize war. Hillary Clinton voted to authorize the invasion of Iraq. You interviewed Muammar Gaddafi, and you asked him who would benefit if the Iraq invasion actually occurred. You write, "The Libyan dictator had a habit of theatrically pondering before answering my questions, but his reply to that one was instantaneous. Bin Laden, he said. There's no doubt about that. And Iraq could end up becoming the staging ground for al-Qaeda, because if the Saddam government collapses, it will be anarchy in Iraq. If that happens, actions against Americans will be considered jihad." Yeah. These are the words of the Libyan leader who ruled for, what, like 42 years.
Yeah.
You interviewed him.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, and he was absolutely prescient of what was going to happen in Iraq. I had been trying to get an interview with Muammar Gaddafi for almost 3 years, and I finally got it. I'm convinced, because by the autumn of 2002. The drumbeat for war in Iraq was really building. I mean, it seemed pretty clear that the anti-war demonstrations were not going to have an effect. We were going in. And Gaddafi was worried that he was going to be next, that after the Bush administration overthrew Saddam Hussein, that they were going to come after him. And the Bush administration had already been floating that out. They had a hit list. And Gaddafi was on there, then Assad was somewhere down the list, because he, in Syria, they weren't the full-fledged axis of evil, but they were rising up. So so I went and spent 3 weeks in Libya and interviewed Gaddafi, and he was absolutely right. Everything he predicted came true to the T.
Did he talk about what would happen to him?
No. And the very interesting thing is, one of the most memorable things in the interview is it was almost my last question to him. It's kind of a platitudinous question. I said, "How would you like to be remembered?" And he was so comfortable in the interview and so kind of arrogant about his position in Libya. He started off giving this kind of very, very platitudinous answer. It's like, well, I would hope to be remembered as selfless, that I gave to my people, that, there's these kind of throwaway answers. And then he kind of paused for a second, and he chuckled, and he leaned towards me, and he said, "And I hope this is actually really true." In other words, maybe it's all just been all about me. Anyway, so no, I don't think he had any clue that what was coming. Nor did I think it over and over again. And I don't think Hosni Mubarak, right up until the day he had to resign, he ever thought he was going to go. I think it's part of the nature of these kind of personality cults these dictators build around themselves, that they're so inoculated that they've just really lost touch with reality.
I wanted to ask you the bigger question that you try to tackle here: what went wrong with the Arab Spring? Because we're in a situation right now where, both in Europe and in the United States, people are faced with this enormous, one, refugee problem out of the Middle East, and two, these failed states, including Yemen, which we haven't talked about at all. Yep. And yet there's no connection made between growing intervention from Europe and the United States is leading to more destabilization rather than less, and how you get out of that situation.
Yeah, it's very hard. If there's any consolation in the current situation, I think we're kind of near the bottom of how bad it can get. It's hard to see how places get much worse. Although Libya is going to get worse next year, because along with the kind of division between different militias, you're also headed for an economic crash that's coming in Libya next year. They're just running out of money. It's hard to see how Syria gets worse. It's hard to see really how Iraq gets worse. But I think that. So it's very hard to see what an intervention actually looks like. I've often thought, well, what is the Obama administration's foreign policy in the region? And I don't think it really has one. I think it's utterly reactive at this point. But then it's hard to imagine what a proactive policy in the region would actually look like. I mean, what do you do in a place like Syria? I mean, at least in Iraq, there now seems to be kind of an operating coalition against ISIS. But I think the problem, and I personally feel that militarily ISIS is going to be pretty much destroyed in the near future. But ISIS is not just a military, it's not a guerrilla group anymore. It's an idea. And as I was talking about, these young men, you have millions and millions of young men throughout the Middle East with no economic futures, who are not necessarily religious or even political in any way. But also what you have throughout the region is a kind of a built-in resentment against the West. So that whole breeding ground is just going to continue on, and I don't see how you deactivate that.
Well, we want to thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Any word to the wise on how to read this entire issue, which also has a virtual reality tour of the retaking of Fallujah with Iraqi soldiers?
Right. I don't know. It's hard for me to say how to because it's been my baby for a year and a half now. I don't know how to suggest how to treat it. I think like it's the story of 6 stories are kind of interwoven, and I think to find the stories that I think different stories will resonate with different people, and to stay with that.
Well, I want to thank you, Scott Anderson, who has written this remarkable total issue of the New York Times Magazine called Fractured Lands, How the Arab World Came Apart. In print, it occupies the whole issue. That does it for our broadcast. Very special congratulations to Dave Enders and his wife, Monica, their new baby, Sophie Grace. Welcome to the world. Democracy Now! Has some job openings, including senior news video producer. Go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Gina Guzder, Sam Alcoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Tarina Nadura, and Andre Lewis, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our website is democracynow.org. Thanks so much.